Good evening and welcome. I'm Alastair Cooke and this is the Tech Talks coming to you from the hang space at VMworld 2015 in Barcelona. That's where I am this week. I thought it was about time that I talked about AutoLab again because it's been, I realised, about 3 years since I did a Tech Talk about AutoLab, and so I was going to bring the new features of AutoLab version 2.6 because the last time I did this it was version 1, if that. So first, a little bit about myself. For those who aren't familiar with my history, I am an independent consultant, analyst and trainer. I'm based in New Zealand and I get to travel to lots and lots of different conferences as part of the vBrownbag crew actually organising these tech talks, so that's an absolutely awesome thing to do. Recently I've released my first training course on Pluralsight, so there's a training course on the new features of Horizon View 6. And I also write for Tech Target as well as more recently also for the virtualization practice. So I'm all kinds of content generation. One of the big pieces of content that I've created is this thing called the AutoLab. And while I've titled this course, this presentation to be about the new features in the AutoLab, I thought I'd recap the things that it's really all about because it has been so long since I talked about it. You can see it's VMware Fusion 4 and Workstation 8 as the versions that I've got box shots of on here. This slide is so old. The AutoLab aims to give you the ability to very rapidly build a vSphere cluster using a single physical computer and using that magic of nested virtualization to run an entire test dev lab playground on one physical server or one physical PC. And I started with a really old Core 2 Duo laptop building this back for vSphere 4. Now you need a little more resources, but not a vast amount more. To get hold of the AutoLab itself, you go to the labguides.com website, and the name of that website hints at how AutoLab came to be. Myself and Nick Marshall were going to write a lab guide to help you to study for your VCP certification, and as part of the process we needed a lab environment for you to do the actual hands-on activities. And the second time I had to rebuild that, like any properly lazy systems administrator, I said, I don't want to rebuild this by hand again, I'm automating this. 6 months later, I had an automation process for building the lab, and that's what AutoLab is. You go to labguides.com, you provide some credentials or some information to our current sponsor Infinio, and then you download this roughly 280 megabyte download that contains a heap of shell virtual machines and a bunch of automation. The other thing you really must download from the site is the deployment guide. This thing it doesn't work without some knowledge on your part, and that knowledge is codified in the deployment guide. A lot of the trouble people have as they start using the AutoLab for the first time is not reading the deployment guide and not really understanding the build process because it is quite intricate and it is quite fragile. You need to have all of the right things in the right places. So definitely read the deployment guide and follow through the workflow for the virtualization platform you're going to use. And for outer virtualization platforms, the AutoLab supports VMware Workstation, Player, Fusion, ESXi with or without DRS. So lots and lots of options. The other thing we have is we have a subreddit. Our forums on the LabGuide site got overrun with Russian spammers, so we decided to hand over running of forums to an organization that runs a lot of forums. So if you go to Reddit, there is a subreddit for AutoLab, and that's where we do all of the interactive support for AutoLab. Definitely use those forums if you run into issues where nothing makes sense, because that absolutely can happen, particularly the first time you deploy the AutoLab. What else do you need beyond that 280 meg download and the deployment guide? You need a piece of hardware to run AutoLab on top of. As I said earlier, I started with an old Core 2 Duo with 8 gigs of RAM and 120 gig SSD, and that was great for vSphere 4, it was okay for 5, but now that we've got vSphere 6 out with its vastly increased memory resources, it doesn't cut it. You need a machine with 16 gigs of RAM, and if you can get a machine with 32 gigs of RAM, even better. You'll need at least 100 gigs, preferably a couple of hundred gigs of SSD. Now, 4 years ago when this was brand new, that much SSD cost you more than replacing this whole kit would now, so it's good that those prices have dropped. The other thing to be aware of is that everything inside that AutoLab download is freely redistributable. It's either open source or it is explicitly freely redistributable. There's nothing in there that you even have to sign up to get the free download. It's all completely redistributable. That means there is no vSphere software and there is no Microsoft software in there, because neither of those can be distributed without a license. Also, they're rather larger than the 280 megs download for AutoLab. Now, most of you who are working in virtualization will have access to this. Either one of your colleagues will have this, you will have downloaded it yourself, or you find a mentor who, maybe through VMworld, you find somebody who's mentoring you in your education. They'll help you out with this. The other thing you need is half a day to do your initial build of the lab. Well, I say half a day, it really depends how lucky you are about how well you followed the instructions and whether you've got all of the dependency pieces. Because some people have found that it takes them multiple days to do the first build because they have to go and chase all the parts, and particularly if you don't have older versions of Windows as used to be required, it can be a real pain to find all of the things. So do expect that the first time there'll be a lot of chasing of dependencies, finding the right installers, but after that, the rebuild of the entire AutoLab environment, that nested lab, can take as little as an hour and a half. So on my development machine that I use, I have a wrapper script that will do a full rebuild for me, and it takes just under 90 minutes to do a rebuild completely from scratch of the entire environment. And you do that anytime you completely mess up, and that's one of the magic things about the AutoLab, is that no matter how badly you screw up the AutoLab environment, you can rebuild it in half a day, and of that half day, you mostly walk away from it and let it run its own scripts. You get to do something more useful than watching Windows install and watching vCenter install. When it's built, the AutoLab looks like any other vSphere cluster. So this is the old vSphere client inside a console on the vCenter virtual machine inside VMware Player. So this is on my old 8 gig of RAM Core 2 Duo machine. Inside there you can see that the vSphere client is showing an actual vCenter server with a data center and a cluster with a couple of ESX servers and some VMs running. That's the whole point about AutoLab. All of that is contained inside one physical computer. What can I do with it? One of the key things is the AutoLab likes to automate stuff for you, but usually there are phases in your education where you don't want those automations, where maybe you haven't installed vCenter 100 times like those of us who have been doing this for a few more years. If you're just starting out, you're probably going to want to manually install vCenter at some point. So you can turn that off. You can choose which bits you want to automate, which bits you want to do by hand. And there's an as-built document as part of that deployment guide that tells you what settings you should use as you're building by hand. And I highly recommend trying to manually build something that replicates or manually build the AutoLab environment as part of the training. The other thing that I really value AutoLab for is fearless trying stuff. Now, as you're learning, you often come across these moments where you think to yourself, what happens if I do this? And as a trainer teaching VMware's training courses, that was often a question that students would ask. In a structured training course with a lab environment that takes days to rebuild, you say, don't try that, it might break stuff. In AutoLab, it's go break stuff. Who cares? Right? If it's really broken, rebuild it, and tomorrow lunchtime you'll be able to try something different. And that lack of fear as you try things is really important to education. It's how you really learn stuff. By the way, you learn even more if you break it and then fix what you broke, rather than rebuilding. But you always know you've got the parachute of rebuilding. The AutoLab was designed to be a lot like VMware's training labs that they use for the training courses for both the VCP and the VCAP certifications, and so it's a really good environment. I know a lot of the people who use AutoLab use it to prepare for certification. That's absolutely what it was there for. So it's a great way in. Of course, now you'll be studying for your VCAP VCP 6 and your VCIXD, whatever name they've called those advanced exams this week. So what's new in AutoLab version 2.6? This is the version that was released earlier this year, and the headline thing was support for vSphere 6. Prior versions, basically I've released new versions of AutoLab every time a new version of vSphere is released. Sometimes there was a really long lag. Happily there wasn't much of a lag here because I had some support from Ravello to put some time in and actually get the vSphere 6 support. The other big change is, as a result of vSphere 6 support, more RAM requirement. vCenter needs 8 gigs of RAM, so our vCenter virtual machine needs to be bigger. The ESX servers will not even install with less than 4 gigs of RAM. And so to get a 2-node cluster, you need 16 gigs of RAM in your physical server. As I said earlier, more is always good. More RAM is one of the key things. Another thing that I found out of the deployment, I've got a changelog file in the build folder on this, and I realized, yes, I had added support for having Windows Server 2012 as in the nested VM. So now, back on version 2.0, Windows Server 2012 was the standard platform for all of the Windows servers. Now I've allowed it to be used as nested automatically, because unlike me, a lot of the people who are learning vSphere now were not in IT when Windows Server 2003 was released. Some of them were still in high school. And consequently, they don't have those ISOs hanging around, and having some nested virtual machines to play with is really important. The other really cool thing in version 2.6 was the support for Revelo. Revelo is an awesome company who have an amazing hypervisor that runs on top of public cloud that can then run ESX. So it's ESX inside the Revelo hypervisor, inside the hypervisor of your cloud provider. 3 layers deep. Scary. And the scariest thing is it works. So I'll be talking tomorrow about running AutoLab on Revelo, because it is quite different to running it on your own hardware, but that was the other big thing in version 2.6, and it was Revelo support that enabled me to get version 2.6 out fairly shortly after vSphere 6 shipped. And then I realized that version 2 was a big release, as you'd expect, a 2.0 release after years of, well, 0 point something and then 1 point something. Version 2 was a big maintenance release, and it particularly allowed me to get Windows Server 2012 support. And I can tell you it was a pain in the ass switching from Windows Server 2008 R2 automated installs to 2012 automated installs. Microsoft made some stupid changes, lots of pain. But with some help from my friends, I worked out how to do this, and now the default is to use Windows Server 2012 eval ISO for both the domain controller and the virtual center server. And of course I work with Vue a lot, and I needed Vue 6 support in order to write my course for Pluralsight. That also got rolled into version 2. So not a huge amount of change other than version adds for version for AutoLab 2.0 and 2.6. There's a whole heap of other stuff on the underside, so I've got a list of about another 50 minor issues to fix with whatever the next release of AutoLab is, so there's always little bits of fix coming along, and if you're using AutoLab and you find something that it doesn't do optimally, just post it up on the subreddit or email me directly. Particularly email me directly if you fixed the problem rather than just found it. And we can incorporate those changes in and just generally make it better for everybody who uses AutoLab. So there will be lots of little fixes in the next release. VMware haven't released a new version of vSphere. They haven't, and Microsoft haven't released a new version of Windows, so I don't have to add extra supports. 2016 server will come at some stage when it's supported by VMware. The other thing I really need to do is replace the version of FreeNAS that's in AutoLab. It was the latest version when I upgraded FreeNAS a little while ago, but it's a bit flaky. If you've had problems with VMs hanging inside of AutoLab, the nested virtual machines, it's often because the FreeNAS build that's in there is flaky, so I need to update to a newer one. And I also need to update some of the nested virtual machines, particularly the desktop virtual machines that we use with Vue. So there's support for building a Vue environment with AutoLab as well. I need to bring those to more recent versions as well. But that's all I really had to say about the newer versions of AutoLab version 2.6 and 2.0. If you haven't already played with AutoLab, do go out and spend some time with it. It's a great tool to help you get certified and to learn more about vSphere. And as soon as Damien pays some attention, he'll be able to cut the end off this. And yeah, watch out for a lot more great content from the vBrownbags, and I'll be talking tomorrow about running AutoLab on top of Revelo.